Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks from Braintree High School, and here we are to talk about our civil rights topic, the Freedom Rides and the Freedom Riders. So let's get to it. So our goal, of course, is always to kind of examine history to see what lessons we can, curate from it, learn from it. So let's talk about the problem that the Freedom Riders were taking on, that the Freedom Rides took on. And that problem was predominantly in the South. I mean, not all problems are exclusive to the South, but in this case, a little bit. Segregation was a big deal. And segregation is going to cause some issues, specifically for interstate buses, interstate highways. Those are highways that aren't just in states, but they're paid for by the federal government. They go from state to state, but also all the rest areas on those highways, and of course the restaurants and the bathrooms. And ultimately, the point of view of the Freedom Riders is this is not fair. Segregation is condescending. It's not equitable. It's a terrible practice for a million reasons, and it needs to go away. So in 1960, there's going to be a protest. A series of people, Freedom Riders, are going to protest. They're called the Freedom Rides, and they're going to try to desegregate interstate highways and all those things. So the Freedom Rides are just going to be one of the many battles as part of the civil rights movement. Lots of battles, right? So in 1954, there was Brown v. Board of Education, Emmett Till in 55, the Montgomery bus boycott 55 to 56, Little Rock 9 crisis, that would be 1957, sit-ins, which really came to a head in the 1960s. And one of the next battles, and there are many battles, of course, are the Freedom Rides. So it's a little bit of a long story, but let's get to it. Let's begin. So the United States is basically a government. To understand the Freedom Rides, you have to understand the structure of our government. Our government is basically split into two formal parts, and this is called a system of federalism. We have a central government, a national government out of D.C., Washington, D.C., and then we have all the states. And the founding fathers wanted this system because they thought that we needed to be kept together to be strong. That's the job of the national government. But at the same time, they thought that the local people knew those people best, that there could be cultural differences among individual areas in the country, and maybe at certain times different laws were appropriate for different places. And those states would make those laws. So we could have different laws in different places, sometimes and sometimes not. And that's a system of federalism. It sounds great, except the federal government and state governments don't always agree about what is right. And for example, this presentation will hit one of them, segregation. So the South is going to be like, we have the right to determine whether we want segregation or not. Federal government should stay out of it. And the federal government's like, no, this is a very important thing that all 50 states or 48 states should be on the same page for. So we get a little bit of disagreement about the role of segregation when it comes to buses and interstate highways and all of the bathrooms and restaurants along the way. But the federal government, again, they were against segregation, at least to this point in the early 60s. And so when there's a federal highway that is paid for by the federal government that has banned segregation, that runs through states which have segregation, we now have a problem, right? Because it's two different sets of laws. And a southern state might be like, no, we want segregation. The federal government's like, no, this is federal land. You can't have segregation. But the federal land is in a southern state. You can see how the system of federalism can get a little tricky. So the interstate highways are going to cause a little bit of an issue. So let's go back in time so we understand our context. Well, in 1946, Irene Morgan got onto an interstate bus that was traveling from Virginia all the way to Baltimore, Maryland. Now, Virginia law said segregation's fine on interstate, really anywhere, but certainly on buses. But on federal highways, there is no segregation. And so basically on July 16th, 1944, the bus driver said, get to the back of the bus. The back is where people of color, African Americans go. And she's like, no, this is federal land. Segregation is outlawed. So I'm not going back there. She ultimately got arrested for violating Southern or Virginia's law of segregation. She goes to prison. She gets pretty upset about this and she sues, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, we basically have the state of Virginia versus the national federal government, and it's going to be known as Morgan versus Virginia, Morgan v. Virginia. States like, well, we were in Virginia, and the federal government was like, but this was on federal lands. So the Supreme Court has to interpret the Constitution of which law wins. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled in 1946 that the federal government won. This was on the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce and paid for interstate highways, and this was an interstate bus. So in 1946, interstate highways were declared to be non-segregated in all the federal land on the side. So that is segregation, right? So segregation's gone. Sweet, victory. However, the South was like, I'm not going to listen to this. The Supreme Court can decide what they want. It's not like they have an army to tell me what to do with. So the Southern argument was basically that the Constitution created the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment said all the powers of our government that aren't expressly said to be owned by the federal government are reserved to the states. And if you look in the Constitution, there's nothing that talks about segregation. So therefore, under the 10th Amendment, the states get to make up their mind about it. And that means the states have rights, states' rights to make this decision. The whole point of the 10th Amendment was to preserve the strength of the states, to make sure there wasn't a faraway central government getting all powerful, taking rights away from the people in the states. So anyway, I get that. That's a rational, kind of intuitive argument. But the federal, it's supposed to keep the 10th Amendment is supposed to keep the federal government weak. And the argument number two of the South was, who cares anyway? Southern African Americans, they like segregation. It's good for white people, good for black people. So, it's only these northern jerks that come down and try to tell them what to do on their own land. So that's another big of their argument. They use the word outside agitators. It's only outsiders that are creating all these problems, northerners, federal people. So they're saying just mind their business. This is Virginia. Let Virginia choose its own laws, which is also an intuitive argument, and maybe even a constitutional one, maybe. So in 1946, the South basically was ignoring that decision and would not follow that decision for really the next 16 years, you could say. Now, who's going to fix the facts that that Virginia is going to ignore the Supreme Court decision? Well, in 1952, we have President Eisenhower. Well, Eisenhower wanted nothing to do with aggravating the South, thought that the federal government probably should stay out of these affairs, and thought that the federal government was trying to force the South to move quickly in its ways, and that would only lead to conflict. So he was inactive, certainly didn't step it up. In 1960, John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, very, very progressive and liberal, against segregation. No, he's not going to step it up either. His priority was to focus on the Cold War. He was trying to prevent the world from blowing up. Segregation was definitely secondary or third or whatever it would be. However, he also just barely won his election in 1960. And he only won it by winning the South. And if he basically forced the South to end segregation and forced the South to change on racial affairs, he's going to anger the South and he's going to lose his next election. And he doesn't want to do that either. So in a kind of cowardly self-preservation type of way, Kennedy's not going to step it up to do the right thing, although I do believe in his heart he knew what the right thing was. So who's going to fix this? Well, it turns out that in 1960-61, there's an organization that had been around for some time called CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. They're going to want to fight to basically desegregate interstate highways. Their objective is to end segregation on those interstate buses, on those interstate highways, in those rest areas, those bathrooms, those restaurants. Now, their strategy of CORE, led by James Farmer, is going to be to do something called the Freedom Rides. This is going to be a protest where they're going to get on buses and they're going to start in Washington, D.C. They're going to ride all the way through the South, all the way to New Orleans. Now, that's their path that you can see right now, and they're going to go all that way. And what they're going to do is African-American freedom riders are going to go into the white-only bathrooms and the white-only restaurant counters, and they're going to purposely break those rules of segregation. And the white riders are going to go into the African-American bathrooms, the African-American lunch counters, and so on. Their goal of going into the wrong places and violating those segregation rules is, number one, they almost want to court violence. They hope that if they do this, they're going to anger some violent Southerners and that they will be attacked. Now, of course, if they're attacked, that's going to cause newspapers and television to come and film it. And if that happens, it's going to draw attention to the fact that they got attacked by only doing what the Supreme Court said they had the right to do, that they were following the law. And if they bring attention to that, Kennedy is going to have to say, you're right, people are getting beat up for following the law, I need to do something about it, and force the South to comply with the law. That's the idea, that they will draw attention to the fact that the South is breaking the law, and that will force Kennedy to basically act. I mean, goal number two of the Freedom Riders was to use nonviolence in this situation. So if they are nonviolent and people get violent with them, the cameras will make it look like they're the good guys and the South is the bad. And that's the way that you get more people to join your cause. And when you get more people to join your cause by looking like the good guys, you gain power. And with power comes the ability to change the laws, right? Gives you leverage. Goal number three of the Freedom Riders is to draw all of that attention and to, again, court violence. But when that violence happens against them, it's going to make the South look guilty like the bad guy, right? And again, John F. Kennedy is not going to be able to ignore violence. He's going to have to deal with it. And if violence is happening against people that are just following the law, that's going to control Kennedy to actually tell the South to start following the law. He's going to crush their segregation. So that's what the goals of this was, right? To court violence, to be peaceful, to make the South look bad, and force Kennedy's hand. So let the Freedom Rides begin. So in 1961, James Farmer, the head of CORE, is going to recruit people to go on these freedom rides. He needs the right people, right? He's going to put them through training. Part of the training is to basically ensure that you're going to be nonviolent. That when somebody yells a racist epitaph at you or makes fun of your mother or dumps something on you, then you're not going to respond negatively. Because if you respond negatively, you're the one that's going to get arrested. There are going to be photographs of you looking like the bad guy, and that's not how you're going to win this situation. So you have to be able to take it. You have to be able to look like a good guy when bad guys attack you. So they're going to go through training, and they're going to prove that their temperament is good, and then the Freedom Riders are going to be chosen. On May 4th, 1961, the Freedom Riders are going to go on this bus for the first time in Washington, D.C. They were both white and black, fighting for the same cause. They're going to travel throughout the South and all the way to New Orleans, violating segregation, hopefully drawing some attention. So they're going to go all the way down from Washington, D.C. into Georgia with almost nothing happening. And then they're going to enter Alabama. And that's when the story really starts to get hot. And by hot, I mean sad. So they're going to go into Alabama, the deep South. And on May 14th, 1961, when they get into Alabama, there's going to be two buses of Freedom Riders. The first one pulls into Anniston, Alabama. And it goes into the bus station. And people knew that they were coming. Immediately, that bus gets its tires literally slashed. And then in this situation, a group of protesters, in this case, protesters against the Freedom Rides, literally sit down in front of the bus to prevent it from leaving so the rest of the protesters can swarm the bus. Well, eventually he is kicked out of there and the bus starts going again. But the problem is all of those people that were against the Freedom Rides, they get in their cars, their trucks, and they chase the bus down. The bus eventually loses air in its tires and it goes flat and it pulls over to the side of the highway. And the people that are against the Freedom Rides break the windows of the bus and then throw a firebomb into the bus, trying to burn those people alive. They specifically locked the doors in the bus so the people couldn't get out. So they choked to death and whatnot. And they're going to burn to death. Now, this is what these people were doing in reaction to people that were attacking segregation. Can you imagine that? Going to the wrong restaurant, going to the wrong bathroom is a death sentence in the circumstance. So a little time goes by, a few minutes, and a police officer finally shows up. Says, "You guys have had enough fun." Fires his gun into the air and chases them away. And then that bus, the people get off, and there it is burning. So as you look at this bus, this is exactly what the Freedom Riders had to endure. Near-death experience. Look at this bus as it keeps burning. That would have been all of those people if that cop hadn't shown up. Look at the bus. It's destroyed. Absolutely destroyed. Now, the second bus at the exact same time, remember, this is a time before there are some satellites, but before really satellite TV. Second bus on May 14th, 1961 doesn't go to Anniston. It bypasses that and goes straight to Birmingham. So they're in Birmingham, Alabama. The governor of Alabama, a guy named John Patterson, is basically on television acknowledging that the Freedom Riders are looking for trouble, that they're evil, they're looking for a fight, and that he won't protect them. Well, anyway, when they show up into Birmingham, there's a police chief called Bull Connor, and he has assured these tough people that are part of a mob that they will be given 15 minutes, and the police will not show up, and they can have their way with these Freedom Riders, and when they will not be arrested. So the Birmingham police will not show up, and they don't show up for 15 minutes. The Freedom Riders show up to Birmingham and into that bus station, and they get attacked. They get attacked by a large number of people that just keep beating them. Now remember, they are not willing to fight back. And they get hit with weapons. They're bloody. Again, the Freedom Riders are massively hurt. So the governor at this point says, this is the Freedom Riders' fault. They came here looking for violence, which is in a way partially true, but the police actually didn't protect them on purpose. So you could argue, I mean, they were just following the law. So everybody's like, oh, the South is terrible. And other people are like, these Freedom Riders, they're terrible. They're the ones causing it. So immediately when you do a protest that you know that's going to aggravate people and you know that that tension is needed to create change, are you to blame, the protester? Or is the other group that you're protesting against to blame? Obviously, the people that are creating mob violence and attacking are the ones to blame, and then some. So again, Governor Patterson is saying, well, these are outside agitators. They're not even from here. Why do they have a right to protest our laws and get hurt? So on May 15th, 1961, the protesters are now in Birmingham, right? So now what happens? They're beat up, and then the other protesters are in Anniston, and they've been firebombed. I mean, what happens next? Now, they're supposed to go on to Montgomery. That's the next spot, but there's no bus drivers that are willing to take them. Nobody wants to be firebombed or killed or attacked by a mob. So the bus driver quits, and then CORE quits. And by quits, I mean they basically say, we just got badly hurt. We don't want to get killed. This is not okay. So they get scared and don't want to continue. They also can't find a bus driver. So in a way themselves, they quit. And they say, well, we can't get to New Orleans. So they actually charter a plane and they fly to New Orleans and declare victory. It's sad because the Freedom Riders have now been stopped. You could argue that they failed, that violence went up against them and they were done, that the South had won. The lesson that has been taught, the message is taught, that if people fight for their rights or fight against segregation, beat them up and they will quit and they will go away. That's a dangerous, dangerous lesson to teach the world, the U.S. and the South. So who's going to fix this situation? The Freedom Riders have stopped. The South has won, so to speak, maybe. Well, there is a young student, a college student named Diane Nash, and she's in Nashville with other students, and she's one of the leaders of an organization not called CORE, but called SNCC. It's called Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it's a brand new organization. They have been behind the sit-in movement that took down segregation in Nashville. They are young and risk takers and so on. They have energy and they're willing to risk their lives. Young people tend to be. Now, CORE was not. They were older and obviously they were willing to take risks. But like older people, sometimes they're a little more conservative and reserved. These students are aggressive in fighting the civil rights battle. So they come all the way down from Nashville into Birmingham, where CORE has already left, and they have vowed to finish the Freedom Rides, pick up where CORE has left off. So the Freedom Rides are back on, and now SNCC is leading the way. So they're in Birmingham, and they're going to try to travel to the next stop, Montgomery, and then to Jackson, and then to New Orleans. So now at this point, John F. Kennedy's like, what are you doing? Didn't you see what happened in Anniston, the firebombing and the mob? You're going to get somebody killed. This is irresponsible. That is a very intuitive statement. But Robert Kennedy, Attorney General, he says, this is going to lead to violence. You guys are causing violence. Stop. And that's very intuitive as well. But of course, Diane Nash says, we cannot let violence, the South, overcome nonviolence. We need to get rid of segregation. We can't let people attack us and then give up on our causes. We're willing to die. And that's what she says. So the problem is that the student, SNCC, so to speak, is in Birmingham and they can't leave because there's a massive mob there and nobody is willing to take them. So anyway, that seems like a barrier. The Freedom Rides, even with this new group, are stuck in Birmingham. And there's mobs there and there's mobs everywhere, and they're going to get killed if they continue. So Attorney General Robert Kennedy, working for John F. Kennedy, basically tells John Patterson, listen, do you want us to send the army in to protect people and their right to go on buses? Really? You don't let people go on buses without getting killed? I'll send troops right now. And of course, John Patterson, Alabama doesn't want to be taken over by the federal government like Arkansas, Little Rock was taken over in 1957 by Eisenhower. So John Patterson says, not my fault. These are outside agitators. They're selfish. But I'll tell you what, I don't want to be taken over. Fine, I will protect them. So he calls his state police and is willing to protect them with his own National Guard. On May 17, 1961, the Freedom Riders get on buses, this time SNCC, and they're going to travel from Birmingham to Montgomery. Now, the Alabama State Police are going to protect them. There they are in Birmingham, and they even have a helicopter flying over the bus, and John Patterson is protecting them, kind of under duress, but he's still protecting them. So they travel all the way. It gets to the point where they can even take a nap, go to sleep. That's how protected they feel. But when they get to Montgomery, the state police back off. Now that they're entering Montgomery, the protection disappears, and Patterson's police go away because they're leaving state highways now, and they're going into Montgomery, which has its own system of government and, of course, its own police. So John Patterson said at this point, well, I pulled my people off because they were going into territory that's not mine. This belongs to the mayor of Montgomery and the police there. So suddenly, when they pull into that station, there's no longer protection there. A mob shows up, but not just a mob, a significantly bigger mob than anything that was in Birmingham. And so this is known as the Montgomery riots. It's not just at the beginning, it's going to keep going. But at first, at the bus station, it's 300 people to 21 riders. And there they are. It's a terrible picture, but an endless amount of people are ready to attack the Freedom Riders. So what actually happens? They hurt and attack and beat the Freedom Riders unencumbered by any sense of Montgomery police. Patterson's going to take the blame, but he's going to blame the leaders of Montgomery. Montgomery's going to blame him. And as you can see, the bloodshed, people massively hurt. Very sad and tragic, terrible thing. So if you are president, what do you do at this point? If you're John F. Kennedy, what do you do? There was violence, and then Patterson said he would protect them, and then he doesn't. So Kennedy at this point is arguing with John Patterson, the governor of the state. He says, it's them, the Freedom Riders, that have caused this violence, not my people. They're breaking our laws. And these outside agitators, they don't have the right to do this. So Kennedy basically says, Patterson, I'm going to have to take over your state the way Eisenhower did with Arkansas. He sends in 400 U.S. Marshals, which is different from the Army, but still a big deal. And they're there armed, protecting the Freedom Riders, but it's not enough. There's riots going on. People are there causing issues. The Freedom Riders can't leave without their lives being at risk. In fact, they leave at one point to go to a church, and the church completely gets surrounded with people ready to burn it down. So Montgomery is not a positive thing. Even with those U.S. Marshals, their lives are at risk. They could be killed at any moment. They can't leave Montgomery. So at this point, Montgomery is way too dangerous, and Kenny's like, Patterson, I'm going to have to send the army in. I'm going to take over your city. And do you really want the U.S. military to take this over? And on May 24th, 1961, a deal is struck. Patterson says, fine, I'll protect them. And he calls out the state police and the Alabama National Guard. And the Freedom Riders at this point are escorted out of Alabama towards Jackson, Mississippi, all the way to the border. So they load the buses, finally, and the Alabama National Guard blocks off the streets, and men with guns, armed everywhere. They even get on the buses to protect them. And there they are on the buses, and they travel out of the state, all the way out of Alabama. This is a good thing. John Patterson, thank you for doing the right thing, even if he did it under protest. So he gets to the border, but he can only protect them to the end of Alabama. So the Freedom Riders enter Mississippi, and as you know, Mississippi is the state where Emmett Till was killed. This is the state with the worst reputation. So people are anxious. So now what happens? Well, Bobby Kennedy was on the phone with the governor, not John Patterson of Alabama, but the governor of Mississippi, a guy that is an ardent segregationist. He talks to Robert Barnett and makes a deal with him. Says, Freedom Riders are coming in. I need you to protect them, or I'm going to have to send the military into your state. And Ross Barnett says, fine, I'll protect them, but they are violating our laws. I'm going to do what Alabama didn't have the guts to do. I'm going to arrest every last one of them for violating segregation. That's our rules in Mississippi. So either way, they're going to violate the laws. I'm going to arrest them. And Robert Kennedy says, fine, do that. Just protect them so I don't have to invade your state with the military. So Mississippi State Police, the Mississippi National Guard, they meet Alabama's troops at the border. The bus comes in, and they then protect the bus. They have guns pointed out to the woods to make sure nobody messes with the Freedom Riders. They protect them all the way to the first stop in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, they are now in prison. And by that, I mean in Jackson, exactly what I said happens. The Mississippi arrest them for violating segregation. They wait till they go into the bus station, and bam, once they violate segregation, they go into the wrong bathrooms, they get arrested, thrown into the paddy wagons. And they never make it to New Orleans. Freedom Riders just don't. This is the end of the protest because all of them are locked up. Now, whatever the goals of the Freedom Riders were, they are now locked up and they aren't on buses or interstate highways anymore. One can say that the protest is over. It's a failure. But something starts to happen. It's a powerful thing getting arrested because newspapers and TV take notice. They start to cover it. They start to care. Getting arrested is a really big thing. So now all of a sudden everybody in the country is talking about it. And then as everybody's talking about it and everybody's attention is on this, other Americans are like, we can't let the South get away with this. So slowly, hundreds of people travel down to Alabama. Some go to D.C. and travel all the way through the same path. Some cut to Birmingham and then travel through Alabama. And then, of course, to Mississippi. And they are protected the whole way. And those Freedom Riders basically become hundreds of Freedom Riders. And now as they travel through the South, they get slowly, one by one, get arrested in Jackson, Mississippi like everybody else and thrown in prison. There were over 430 people that took part. Now they're all behind prison, and new Freedom Riders keep coming, and it keeps it in the news and on the television. And all of that pressure, people getting arrested for just following federal law, is going to pressure the Kennedys to do something about it, because this makes us look really, really, really bad. Number one, all of that media attention makes everybody focus that people can get beat up, blown up, killed, and imprisoned just for following the law. Clearly, people start to turn against the South. Number two, people getting locked up is going to make the South look bad and the Freedom Riders look good. So people are going to start to support the Freedom Riders. Foreign optics are terrible. People getting beat up, blown up, imprisoned for just riding on buses is going to make the world look at us terribly. In the context of the Cold War, Kennedy can't have the world hating us or thinking that we're worse than the Soviet Union. So now he has to do something. And that's going to be a good thing. Now, as a result, on September 22nd, 1961, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy pressure the Interstate Commerce Commission, which technically is the federal agency that's in charge of the highways, to get rid of segregation on these highways, to enforce the actual law. Tell the South, that's it, you're done. You have to follow the law or else. So the Freedom Riders were acceptable. They won. They accomplished their objective. They spent a summer in prison, but that's what they did. They sacrificed. They risked their lives in order to create change, grab publicity, grow their movement. Now, the legacy of the Freedom Riders is so big. Part of it is we've learned that even good people, and I'm convinced that the Kennedy brothers were good, that they were against segregation, but they weren't willing to change it because they would lose votes. Even good people need to be pressured into tough decisions where they have personal loss. And so you can't just say, well, these are good political leaders. Sometimes you have to pressure them. And I think that's an important legacy outcome of this. Number two, a lot of African Americans would not protest white America because they were afraid what would happen. They were afraid of white power and the consequences. And this created courage for people. It specifically got rid of the myth of impotence. For the longest time, any African Americans that would protest against racist laws would lose. And now they saw victory. And this is going to inspire people to do hundreds of other protests because they now knew they could win. And that's an absolutely huge legacy. Also, the tragedy here, the imprisonment, the publicity, the beating up of people, united people together, both white and black, mostly African Americans, into we have to protect each other, we have to protest, we can't let this happen anymore. And sadly, that is a legacy of the Freedom Rides. It united this movement through violence. Sometimes violence against is what is needed. Also, the efficacy of nonviolence. At this point, the movement started coming together that nonviolence was the way to create change. And this was good because this brought publicity to nonviolence, that if you're nonviolent, you can still get attacked. You'll look like the good guy. It will bring attention, and that's how you create change. So this was a win for nonviolence. So the Freedom Rides had a huge legacy, and it's going to create momentum towards future protests that are going to improve life. Specifically, it's going to be one tiny step in that huge momentum to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. And that is going to be the law that bans segregation everywhere. And that is the win. Now, it's still a couple years away, and we have much more to talk about, but the Freedom Rides. Hopefully this presentation met that objective, specifically what happened, but most importantly, it explained why it was so important, and it gave us a few lessons about civil disobedience and what type of protest that is necessary to create change. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to speaking with you and having that conversation on future screencasts.